Hello and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Cartwright, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 1983 historical drama piece titled The Right Stuff. Now, The Right Stuff is an epical movie, so that means that unless you have a short attention span, maybe this may not be the movie for you. Maybe it's not for everyone, I don't know. But it's still a brilliant piece nonetheless. This movie, like I said, runs for 3 hours and 12 minutes long. It is directed by Philip Kaufman. It is produced by both Irwin Winkler and Robert Chartov. Philip Kaufman also wrote the script. It was based on the novel The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe. The score was done by Bill Conti. The cinematography was done by Caleb Deschanel. And it was edited by Glenn Farr, Lisa Fruchtman, Stephen Rutter, Doug Stewart, and Tom Rolfe. And the stars of the movie are Sam Shepard, Fred Ward, Charles Frank, Scott Glenn, Ed Harris, Lance Henriksen, Scott Paulin, Dennis Quaid, Kim Stanley, Barbara Hersey, Veronica Cartwright, and Pamela Reed. And the narration was done by musician slash actor, the late great Levon Helm. So, it goes a little something like this. In the opening scenes of The Right Stuff, we see a cowboy perched on his horse looks on as he observes a peculiar sight in the middle of the desert. A strange object is none other than a sound barrier breaker, which is also known as an X-1 rocket plane. And then by the end of the film, the 7 astronauts that make up the Mercury 7, or the Mercury astronauts, are getting a standing ovation at the Houston Astrodome as they're the host of a Texas barbecue set on by then Vice President Lyndon Johnson. And the opposing scenes from The Right Stuff is a symbolic sign of sheer optimism that Americans still have the right stuff, although it has been altered around a bit. Yes, this movie is set between the late 40s, maybe early 50s, during the time when, there was the whole Cold War situation between the Americans and the Soviets. World War II is long gone. So a new form of hostility was brewing within the Americans as, the Soviets were kind of a bit of a threat to the Americans. In fact, it kind of went as far as to sort of like a bit of a competition. You see the Russians, they were building rockets to go into space. You've heard of Sputnik. And so therefore the Americans, decide that, hey, if the Russians can do it, we can do it, and we can do it better. Because we're the best, better than all the rest. That was just kind of like the ideology back in the 50s and early 60s in America. So the original American heroes were a humble bunch. These were, of course, the 7 astronauts, the very first original astronauts sent in by NASA. And, one day they become humble astronauts just going off into space to see what's it like there on stuff that you don't see on Earth. They really are a humble bunch. They were not caring for spotlight and just going about their business. The cowboy at the beginning is the first example. He rode around the premises with the confines of a partner, and if the partner was there wouldn't be as much use except to look on with superficial fondness. You see, to become a member of the Elite Seven, you have to have the military training, which these guys did. But you also even had to have some form of a degree in science, which is something our lone cowboy didn't have, which was the reason why he was rejected, which is unfair. But sometimes, I guess, when it comes down to it, life is unfair. Remember, this was actually based on true events. Sure, they're going to be dramatized a little bit, because remember, this is not a documentary. This is a movie, so we're going to most likely have some form of hyperbole within the premises of the events, and maybe the reality was that the events here were not as eventful as in real life. So yeah, they're going to doctor it up a little bit to add intrigue to make it feel like a movie as opposed to a documentary. Today's heroes need to form factions and pry on getting noticed as a way to stretch their egos. That was the real reason why Westerns died out after the 1970s. Cowboys don't depend on a sidekick or camaraderie. They work alone and ride off into the sunset. The cowboy at the early scenes in The Right Stuff is a war hero pilot by the name of Captain Chuck Yeager, played by Sam Shepard, a taciturn test pilot who overcame a deadly crash that has taken out several who have tested these planes before him. In fact, in 1 month, 60 had succumbed to their deaths. But he managed to accomplish the impossible. He managed to break the sound barrier record with his rocket launcher, and he has been dubbed as a hero. But he's not going to get the whole spotlight heroic applause like the Mercury 7, because he was not in on the program, because he was rejected, because he didn't have a college education, and that his accomplishments for the long run kind of went unnoticed for a long, long time. But he still managed to go as far as to become a hero. He still managed to write a best-selling novel based on his experiences, and he actually grew to exceptional fame sort of naturally, as opposed to just having cameras and reporters rubbing microphones to their faces. When you think of The Right Stuff, you probably are thinking of the New Kids on the Block's 1988 hit. And then you're probably thinking that this movie was a biopic based on a popular boy band. Well, in some ways, maybe the Mercury 7 were a boy band. except they weren't specializing in vocals, they were specializing in going into space. And just like a popular boy band, they actually had grown to exceptional fame, just like a boy band. Only except for they weren't singing and dancing. Hey, hey, my reviews could be lighthearted sometimes. The movie actually begins with that triumph, but then shifts 10 years later as the Soviets created the spacecraft Sputnik, which led to President Eisenhower and his administration to get into the idea of space travel. They did not want to be upstaged by the Soviets. No. America is going to go out and they're going to build rockets. They're going to travel to space. They're going to break sound barriers. They're going to go faster than the speed of sound. They're going to see what is happening outside of Earth. I mean, this is actually taken, years before we finally put a man on Earth. This is, of course, just the early stages. NASA was still pretty much, a new thing. And being astronauts was a major milestone because these guys eventually became, popular through media, through television, through radio. These guys were the original celebrities that did not necessarily have to shake their pelvises to get attention. No, these guys were genuinely intellectuals who had degrees in engineering, who had all the right requirements to get into space. The astronauts who traveled upon the Mercury capsules depicted in this film have a very similar mindset as Yeager. We have Gus Grissom, played by Fred Ward, Scott Carpenter, played by Charles Frank, and Gordon Cooper, played by Dennis Quaid, have a similar frame of mind like Yeager. But unlike Yeager, the Mercury astronauts were a symbolic staple in the eyes of public relations, and the movie features Mercury astronaut spokesperson John Glenn, played by Ed Harris, speaking out with his unquestionable charm. The X-1 flew without the needs of televised exposure, but the Mercury flights were heavily under the camera, which became the dawning of a new kind of era where space travel and public exposures have clashed. They became celebrities. Yes, celebrities, not like celebrities like a Marilyn Monroe or a Fred Astaire or a Cary Grant or a Jane Russell. No, these guys were celebrities in the world of space travel. And if you can travel through space, you will be billed as an icon. Maybe not in the Hollywood spectrum, but in the spectrum of science. But also, hey, you're also become staple boys for public relations, marketing, merchandise. These guys had it all. These guys were ticket sellers, so to speak. These guys were meal tickets to the public relations. These celebrities who every time they had a camera or a microphone pointed at them, this put food on the table for these reporters and public relations executives. You know, it's just par for the course, I suppose. A lot has transpired in the movie, similar to the events that the book by Tom Wolfe that this movie is based on. The film is definitely a wild adventure, saturated with dramatic and special effects, social commentary, and a bit of satirical merit to its credit. I guess the satirical merit might probably come in the form of Vice President Lyndon Johnson. But the thing of the matter is, I would have probably, since this movie was much more serious than humorous and much more of a reality than a parody, I still kind of found that the actor who portrayed Lyndon Johnson sort of passed Johnson off as a bit of a satirical spoof rather than a much more realistic, authentic Lyndon Johnson. Sure, he had the physical looks like Lyndon Johnson, and of course, you know, because he also had a bit of the southern accent, sort of like the way how President Lyndon Johnson spoke. This guy definitely certainly did have all the idiosyncratic traits about him. That's kind of like the way how Lyndon Johnson used to speak, because, you know, he was from Texas. Have yourselves a big old barbecue, boys. With all these events going on at once, it's an amazing accomplishment that writer-director Philip Kaufman was able to cram all of it into a 3-hour plus film. All the material sums up to being one of the greatest films that came out in the 1980s. The moods and styles just flow in a natural position as they satirically take down the corrupt government suits to Yeager's loner characterization and Glenn's bid to think how these astronauts can get the adulation that they rightfully deserve. And aside from, you know, the focus being on the Mercury 7 astronauts and our lone wolf pilot, Chuck Yeager, there is, of course, some human drama which also seems to spark some reality factors in there. I mean, you know, the growing concerns seems to also come from their back home with their wives and their kids. And, you know, and that's also believable too, you know, when you think about it through the thick of things. It's just as believable, yes. I mean, their parents, I mean, their wives, yeah, maybe even their parents, I don't know, it depends if they're still alive. Their wives, maybe, mostly. They're very, very concerned about their husbands, you know, because of the fact that they're not home as often as they should, because they're out, you know, trying to change the world, change the landscape of how we think, set up some major milestones in the scientific community. Astronomy has now kind of taken a much more higher leap. Publicity. These concerns have come from the form of their wives. You know, they're concerned that, you know, what if these dangerous missions that they go on could potentially kill them? But you know what? Part of going into space doesn't always require brains, though it is mandatory. Does it require some knowledge and science? Of course. But through the thick of it all, there is one important principal commodity that makes space travel all the more important. Courage. You have to take risks. You have to sacrifice life and limb. You have to show bravery. I mean, sure, it's deadly. Sure, you don't know what's happening in space. Sure, you don't know if you're going to survive through the whole ordeal or if you're going to die. And that's the chance these guys are willing to take. I mean, in a world of uncertainty, you have to expect the unexpected. And that was the mindset for these astronauts. The Right Stuff definitely set a benchmark in the careers of several of these performers, as well as solidified Kaufman among one of the top directors in the film industry. It was just too bad that this guy is very, very underrated. I mean, he should be up there with the likes of Spielberg, Scorsese, George Lucas, James Cameron. And it's just too bad that Philip Kaufman did not become a household name, because this movie really, really helped. This movie was just so damn good. I mean, it's just too bad that Philip Kaufman didn't get the accolades that he truly deserved. It's a shame. It's actually a crying shame, to be honest with you. The performers were all top notch, especially those who haven't been household names at the time. Such names like Ed Harris, Dennis Quaid, Fred Ward, and Scott Glenn all turned in wonderful performances. But the real standout, and God rest his soul, Sam Shepard is the real standout, as he plays Jaeger with the right amount of mysticism and strong presence. It's also one of those very few films that could brag that it could be labeled as a real American epic film. It's an ambitious movie that could take its journey through time and its subject matter as it loosely flows through the locations and the special effects that truly make this a definitive art film. It belongs strongly up there with The Godfather, Nashville, and Apocalypse Now. It's a true classic film that made the 80s all the more special. The 80s was definitely a time of year when movies were at its most creative best. Sure, there was the cheese that came out in the 80s, the materialism, but this movie wasn't materialistic. It was educational, it was entertaining, and yes, okay, there are the naysayers who will say, "Oh, 3 hours is too long." But you know what? It was meant to be 3 hours long. And even though, yes, it was 3 hours long. Yes, it is too long. Sometimes I could get back cramps for sitting for 3 hours. And yes, I would have to find a right time to see a movie that goes on for 3 hours long. But then again, I could say the same thing about movies that do go beyond the 2 hour limit. You know, like the Lord of the Rings movies. Some of them are like 3 hours and 45 minutes long and 4 hours long. Hey, I had to sit through movies like the 10 Commandments and Cleopatra, and those movies go into the 4 hour mark. But yes, okay, I agree. This movie is long. Maybe some scenes could have been deleted or chopped. But I think the purpose of this movie was to try to get everything you can out of this Tom Wolfe novel. And I think Philip Kaufman does a strong job at bringing all the events from Tom Wolfe's novel onto the screen, and I think he did the movie A World of Justice. So with that in mind, I give the 1983 movie The Right Stuff, out of a scale of 10, I give this movie a 9. So I guess this ends my writer review. Thank you all for listening in. If you wish to subscribe to my channel, please feel free to do so. If you wish to leave a comment, go right ahead. But just remember, be kind, be courteous, and please don't be rude. Because, I will be coming over to visit your sites. And I'm probably going to give my 10 cents. And I know that I will not be rude to you guys. So please, do me the favor and don't be rude back to me. Okay? Alright, big hugs to all of you. And until next time, this is Eric Cartwright. Yeah, I'll be back again with another movie review. So until next time, this is Eric Cartwright saying, keep watching those movies, and I'll see you around. Goodbye.